lecture. So we're going to be going over chapter 1. Okay, so chapter 1 is human body orientation, and you're basically looking at terminology. Okay, so the very important part of our class is that we're going to kind of go over the terminology originally because these terms are going to kind of continue to come up in the rest of the chapters for our course. So we want to kind of get a handle on those, and then we just want to practice them as much as possible so that it makes the rest of the chapters a little bit easier. Okay, so we want to always, any course you ever take, if you're taking anatomy, physiology, you're taking histology, they're always going to start off by just defining those terms. So we want to do the same thing. So we want to define anatomy, and we want to realize that this is my form and my structure. Okay, so it means to cut apart. It's going to be concrete. It's going to be studying the structures of the body parts and their relationships to one another. Okay, physiology is going to be a little bit different. So it's not so much my structure, it's actually going to be my function. So it's concerned with the functions of the body and how the body parts kind of work and carry out their activities and their functions together. Okay, so good. Those always come up on all your exams. Do you know just the basic definition of the class that you're taking and the thing that you're studying? One of the big things in our textbook is this complementarity of structure and function. Again, this is going to come up as we move through all the chapters too. But they're basically just telling you that the structure of something is always going to determine its function, and that everything in your body is made in a specific way to perform a certain function. Okay, so a lot of times based on what the structure of something is, what its function is going to be in the body. Okay, so another good just term for multiple choice questions and things like that to make sure that you're familiar with. Your body's going to have many levels of organization, and we want to make sure we know them from the smallest to the biggest. So we have a chemical level, cellular level, tissue level, organ system level, and then an organism, and then each one of these is kind of contribute to sort of making the next one. But again, very good multiple choice question of, can I put these in the proper order from smallest to largest? So at the chemical level, we have atoms, which are the tiny building blocks of matter. We're going to have molecules, so this is when my atoms combine to form molecules. So again, a bunch of atoms are going to make a molecule. This would be water, proteins. The next one is going to be my organelles, and this is going to be when my molecules associate together to form organelles. And then again, my organelles, we're going to look at those a lot in the cell chapter, but they're going to have a specialized structure and a specialized sort of function. So again, I'm taking the smallest one, putting a bunch together, getting the next one, putting a bunch of those together, and kind of getting the next one. This is probably the part where everybody kind of makes their mistake, is that when they're trying to put things in the proper order, we mix up, are atoms smaller than molecules, or are molecules smaller than atoms? So just a key for you to sort of remember is that the atoms are going to be the very, very first one, and then they're going to be what combines to kind of form my molecules. But from all the years that I've taught this class, this is the one where everybody kind of gets it wrong, is that they mix up what comes first, the atom or the molecule. So now we get to the cellular level. So my cells are the smallest units of living things. Good multiple choice question. They're going to have a common structure, but cells are going to vary in size and shape, and this is going to again reflect their unique functions. And again, my cells are going to do everything in my body for me and create all the different tissues in my body for me. So now we get to the tissue level. So these are groups of similar cells that have a common function, common role in the body. We get 4 types. We get to do a whole chapter on these after we do the cell. We get epithelium, we get muscle, we get connective tissue, and we get nervous tissue. And if I want to just break down these 4 types and what their main function is going to be, my epithelium is going to cover and line parts of the body for me. My muscle is going to create movement. My connective tissue is going to support and protect, and my nervous system is going to be the way that my body communicates. Okay, and then we'll look at these a little in depth, and we'll break them down into all the different types of tissues, of epithelium, of muscle, of connective tissue, and so on and so on. Okay, so now we get to the organ level. So an organ is a structure composed of at least 2 types of tissues that perform specific functions. A lot of us are familiar with the organs in the body, so liver, brain, stomach, etc. Okay, but I'm grouping a bunch of tissues together. I'm going to create an organ, and then when I group a bunch of organs together, I'm going to get an organ system. Okay, so organ system, organs that work together to accomplish a common purpose. This is my respiratory system, cardiovascular system, etc. And then I finally get to this organism, or this organismal level, which is the highest level of organization. Good multiple choice question. Represents the sum total of all structural levels working together to keep us alive. Okay, so we come to the next one, which again are the levels from simple to complex: atoms, molecules, organelles. And again, a bunch of atoms make my molecules, a bunch of molecules make my organelles, a bunch of organelles make my cells, and so on and so on and so on. But again, this is a really, really important one for your final exam and for the first unit exam, of just being able to sort of put these in the in their proper order from simple to complex. Okay, so make sure you highlight that and kind of star that. And it's an easy thing to kind of overlook, but again, these questions kind of come up all the time, and we think, okay, I'll remember that, but sometimes it gets a little bit tricky. So now we get to important characteristics of our bodies, which is basically just things that your bodies are going to do. We're going to maintain boundaries. This is a really important one. So the internal environment is going to remain separate from the external environment. And this is, again, my body trying to sort of maintain homeostasis or maintain this environment that it functions best at. Movement, we get our muscular system is going to be used to propel ourselves. You also want to think of movement as we can move things through our body too, okay? So it's not always your muscles moving your joints, but my skeletal system is going to provide my framework. We have responsiveness. This is the ability to sense changes in the environment and to respond to those changes, again, in an attempt to maintain homeostasis. Digestion, the breaking down of ingested food to molecules that can be absorbed, right? We need nutrients to sort of create energy and give our body everything it needs to sort of build things. Metabolism, this one always comes up on your test too, is just the definition of metabolism, because a lot of it, we think of this as like a weight loss thing, but the proper definition of metabolism is that it's all chemical reactions taking place within the body. And again, I'm using ATP, or I'm creating ATP for energy, and I'm also going to use this to power all my cellular activity. Okay, so all chemical reactions taking place is going to be my metabolism. Number 6 is excretion, removing waste. Number 7 is reproduction. This can be cellular reproduction, or it can be that of the organism. And number 8 is going to be growth. And again, this can be an increase in size of a body part or of the whole organism. Okay, so this is another important part too, more for your exams, is that, anything in your chapters that you can kind of list the 6 reasons for this, or the 5, or the types, and anything like that. Those are always good questions that come up on all your tests. So when you're going through your chapters and it says, hey, give me the important characteristics of the body, you want to make sure that you know the headings and that you can list them, and sort of you can get each type of one and then just be able to give a brief explanation of each. Because again, a very easy multiple choice question is, hey, which one of these is not the characteristics of the body? And the other important thing on this one is it says be sure to read the question. So a lot of times there'll be characteristics, there'll be functions, and again, sometimes we don't read the question properly and we might not know exactly what they're sort of asking us. This is also where, when you're doing multiple choice, people always say, should I go back and change my answers, or should I go back and check over all my answers? But the only time you should change an answer for a multiple choice question, because most times when you change it, you switch it to something where you end up getting it wrong, is if you read the question and you didn't quite understand exactly what they were sort of asking. Okay, but especially for my class, if you see anything where there's 5 of this, 4 of this, 10 of this, make sure you start and highlight those, because again, those are great multiple choice questions. Okay, now we get to our systems of the body. So we get basic function of each, and we get all the organs involved. So we're going to go through the first kind of half of our book, and then in part 2 you'll go through a lot of the other systems in the body. But in chapter 1, we just want to have a basic function. We just want to know, okay, what do these systems do? And then what are the organs that are involved in each of these systems that allow them to perform their functions? Okay, so some of these we're familiar with. Integumentary system, that's going to be chapter 5, but this is basically your skin, your hair, your nails. And a lot of times you can kind of guess at what it's going to do and sort of what its function is going to kind of be. Skeletal system we're familiar with, so this is all your bones, right? And we want to know just that it protects, supports body organs, provides a framework for muscles, so that we can create sort of movement. Our muscular system, again, a lot of us are going to be familiar with that. Okay, we're manipulating our environment, we're creating locomotion. We get to our nervous system. This is where we kind of finish off our course, is with the nervous system, but this is, everything that the way the body communicates and controls every single thing that's kind of going on in your body. So we have our brain, our spinal cord, and all our peripheral nerves. Endocrine system is one that people maybe are not so familiar with. We don't do too much with the endocrine system in our course, but these are basically my glands. They're secreting hormones, and then again, I'm trying to sort of control everything that's going on in the body and maintain certain levels and keep my body functioning as much as possible. So when you see endocrine, you want to think of glands and you want to think of hormones. Cardiovascular system, this is my blood vessels. They're going to transport my blood. They're going to carry oxygen. They're going to get rid of carbon dioxide, nutrients, waste, okay? And then my heart is going to pump all this blood through my system and allow me to sort of get all these nutrients to all the different parts of my body and get all the waste out of my body, okay? Lymphatic system, again, when you hear lymphatic system, you want to think about your immunity, but your lymphatic system is basically just going to follow your cardiovascular system, and again, it's going to be just a little filter, and it's going to allow us to kind of get things out of the body that we don't want sort of in there, and just to help to keep us healthy. Respiratory system, we're looking at our lungs, right, bringing air into our body, being able to get the oxygen sort of into the blood to get it circulated to the rest of the body. We get our digestive system, so this is how we're going to break down food, provide nutrients for the body, create energy. And then we get our urinary system, and this is where we get into where we're just kind of getting rid of waste, right? We're filtering things out that we don't want and getting them out of the body. But you got your kidney, your ureter, your bladder, your urethra. That's more part 2. And then we get to our reproductive system, and again, this is where we're creating new organisms. Okay, so another listing question is going to be survival needs of the body. And again, the main thing they want you to know is what do we need to maintain life? So we need nutrients, we need oxygen, we need water, we need normal body temperature, and then we need this appropriate atmospheric pressure. That's probably the one that we can't think of. But for most of these, if we just ask you, hey, can you write down 5 things that you need to survive, we could come up with most of these, okay, or at least a couple of them. So it's another thing where sometimes if we don't memorize an answer, we don't even bother to sort of do the question. But a lot of times with this, you want to kind of think it through, and you'd be amazed at how many times you can actually come up with the proper answer. Okay, so nutrients, we're going to obtain them through our diet. These are chemical substances for energy cell building. Oxygen, we're going to use again to produce energy. We're going to need water, so 50 to 60% of your body weight is going to be water. It's going to provide a watery environment for reactions. It's going to provide fluid to create body secretions. Number 4 is a normal body temperature. We all kind of know this too, right? We know what our normal temperature is going to kind of be, but it must be maintained. And again, your body's going to function best within a certain range of temperature. But if it's too low, reactions are going to slow down or they're going to stop. And if my temperature is too high, they become too frantic. And again, I get to this where my body's just not going to be functioning properly. Number 5 is the tricky one. So I need appropriate atmospheric pressure. And this is just required for breathing and required for me to get that air into my body and sort of exchange that oxygen and that carbon dioxide in and kind of out of my body. So now we get to homeostasis, and most of us have heard this term probably in high school, but we want to make sure we know the proper definition. So your body's ability to maintain a relatively stable internal condition, okay, even though the outside world changes continuously. So you want to know that we're trying to maintain a stable internal environment, even though everything outside of us is going to change all the time. Okay, so internal conditions are going to vary, but should always remain within relatively narrow limits, and your temperature is a good one to kind of think of, because no matter how hot or cold it is outside, your body temperature is going to kind of stay the same, or your body's going to try to kind of maintain it within these sort of limits. So the body is in homeostasis when its needs are being adequately met and it is functioning smoothly. Most diseases can be regarded as an imbalance, and this is where it's either going to be it's overactive or it's going to be underactive. Okay, so good definition to kind of make sure that you just know exactly what the proper definition of homeostasis, and then just remembering that we're constantly trying to maintain homeostasis in the body. So our bodies are constantly monitoring our systems, sending information through to the brain, and again, they're going to do that through the nervous system. So we're using these neural electrical impulses, and then we're going to use hormones to sort of maintain homeostasis. And the hormones and the glands are going to be your body's effectors, okay, is of how I make changes to bring me back to homeostasis. And this is going to be termed this homeostatic control mechanism. Okay, and another good multiple choice questions are going to come from here too. So control systems or mechanisms. All homeostatic control mechanisms involve at least 3 components, so make sure you can list them. They're going to work together to control a variable, and this is where that medical dictionary comes in really handy, because it's one of those things where you think, okay, I kind of know what a variable is, but maybe I don't know what a variable is. But this is where you want to kind of stop and you get a term that you're not really sure of, and you just want to look it up really quickly. Okay, but the 3 components are the receptor, the control center, and the effector, and again, they're working to control this variable, and then we're going to look at an example of that so that we know exactly what's going on, and it'll make it easier for us to remember. So again, definitions, dictionary, you want to look up the variable is the factor or event being regulated, and then we're also going to have a stimulus in this kind of equation, and this is going to be what's producing the change in the variable. Okay, but a lot of times you want to have an example, and you want to just be like, okay, do I know in the example what part each is kind of playing, and that's what we're going to look at right now. So here is a little teeter-totter, okay? We don't have an example yet, but we're just sort of looking at, how things work. So if it's straight across, we're in balance, okay? And if it's tilted to one side, we're kind of out of balance. But here is my stimulus, and it's going to produce a change in the variable. And remember, the variable is the thing we're trying to control. You're going to have a receptor. Its job is to detect the change. It's going to detect the change and send that info to your control center. Okay, so that's going to be my input is information sent along the afferent pathway to my control center. Okay, and then my control center is going to kind of analyze the info, and then it's going to kind of decide what to do, and then it's going to send information efferently, okay, to my effectors, and they're going to be the way I make the change, okay, and these are going to be my response to sort of bring things back to homeostasis. Okay, so this is a really good one to even make sure that you can kind of draw it and sort of know which way things are traveling. So my receptor is sending input to my control center. My control center is deciding what to do, and then it's going to send input to my effector, okay, and tell the effector what to do to sort of bring me back to homeostasis. But again, we're going to look at an example that'll make it a little bit more clear. And then again, it's always good to have examples because it's easier to remember that way. Okay, so here are what all these things do. So my receptor is some type of sensor. And again, we're going to get to this in the neurological chapter, but it's monitoring my environment. It's going to respond to changes by sending information to my control center. Anything going towards the brain is an afferent pathway, okay? It involves moving or info moving towards the central nervous system, which is my spinal cord and my brain. Okay, so I'm sending info to my brain to be analyzed. Okay, so my control center is going to determine the set point or the level to be maintained. It's going to analyze the input. It's going to determine the appropriate response, and this is going to be an efferent pathway. So I'm moving information or I'm sending impulses away from my central nervous system to my effectors, and again, these are going to be glands or muscles or organs or things like that that are going to sort of change things for me. Okay, so my effector provides a way for the control center to respond to the stimulus. So this is my output, influences the effect of the stimulus, and it's either going to reduce it or slow it down, or it's going to enhance it and speed it up. But again, it's working to bring me back to balance or bring me back to homeostasis. We also have negative versus positive feedback. Okay, and again, we're going to look at an example here in a second. But most homeostatic control mechanisms are going to be negative feedback mechanisms. Another very good multiple choice question. And negative is meaning that it's going to make it less, or it's going to kind of do the opposite to kind of what's happening. So negative feedback mechanisms, the control center response shuts off the effect of the stimulus, or it's going to slow it down. So the variable is going to change in the direction opposite to the initial change. And again, we'll look at the example, but this is where if I was too hot, I'm going to move towards being more cold. If I was too cold, I'm going to move towards being hot. So the change that the body does is going to move things in the opposite direction. So you can take any example and you can just think about, okay, is it moving in the same direction or is it moving in the opposite direction to what happened initially? And that's going to tell you if it's a negative feedback or a positive feedback. Okay, so it returns it to the ideal value. So the example that we're going to have, and this isn't in the body, but this is just in our homes, is going to be your thermostat and your air conditioner or your heater. Okay, so when you're looking at your house and you're thinking about your thermostat, okay, your thermostat is going to house the receptor, and in this example it's going to be a thermometer, so it's going to be able to tell what the temperature in the room is. You're also going to have your control center, okay, because I'm going to be able to set the temperature to what I want it to be. So I can set it to be 68 degrees Fahrenheit. My effector in this example is going to be your heating system or your furnace, or you can switch it around and make it your air conditioning, okay? But the example we have here is that if my house temperature drops below 68, and again, I said I want it to be at 68, what is my heating system going to kind of do, right? I'm going to sense that the temperature has dropped below 68. I'm going to send that input or that output to my furnace, okay, or my heating system. I'm going to turn that on. It's going to warm my house up. It's going to bring me back to 68, and then it's going to turn off, okay? So my furnace produces heat to warm the air. The temperature is going to rise. As soon as I get back to my number 68, my furnace is going to turn off, and I'm back to homeostasis, okay? So the receptor in this example is the thermometer. Okay, and this is also my thermostat. It's going to also house my control center. My effector is going to be my heating system or my furnace. And then I can go back and I can look at that little teeter-totter and I can sort of draw a little circle and I can put everything in the proper little category. Okay, so this is an example. And again, this is another important thing where I've had times where I said, give me an example in the body, and people put the house thermostat. But again, you got to pay attention to the question. You got to see, okay, does he want an example of something in the body, or is he looking for something kind of outside the body? Okay, so that's a good one, just a external example of how this negative feedback is going to work. And then this one is negative because, again, it was getting cold and now it's getting warmer, okay? So I'm moving in the opposite direction to what was happening initially. So here's just a little summary of all the things that we just kind of talked about. But you get, especially if you're a visual learner, you get some pictures to kind of follow along with. And then now we look at temperature in the human body, and we want to realize that this is being controlled by my hypothalamus. Okay, so this is going to be the thermostat for my body, and it's going to either trigger shivering if I'm cold, or it's going to trigger sweating if I get too hot. So let's look at those examples. So here is the heat, sweating in the body, and again, here's our little picture again. My stimulus is heat. Okay, it's going to make my body temperature rise. I'm going to have my receptors in my skin. They're going to sense that I'm getting too hot. They're going to send that information up to my control center, okay, thermoregulating center in my brain. They're going to send impulses to my effectors, which are going to be my sweat glands, okay. They're going to cause me to sweat a little more. And then the response is that the evaporation of sweat on the body is going to end up kind of lowering my temperature for me. And it's going to sort of bring me again back to balance, okay. It's going to bring my temperature back to sort of where I sort of want it to be. So in this example, you just want to be like, okay, what's the control center doing? What's my receptor doing? What's my effector? What's the stimulus? What's the variable? All those different little things are going to be easy to sort of go in a nice little loop here so that you can make sure you understand the role of each part in the system. Now we can look at cold, so we can look at the opposite. So in this example, the stimulus is my body is getting too cold, okay? But I still have receptors in my skin that are monitoring my temperature. They're sending that info to the brain, telling me I'm getting too cold. My brain is going to decide what to do, and what it's going to decide to do is it's going to make my muscles contract a little bit or make me kind of shiver. Okay, so my muscles are the effector. The shivering increases my body temperature, brings me back to normal. I'm back in balance, and then my shivering kind of stops. Okay, so very, very good example of just something we've all sort of, we've all sort of had happen in our lives, or we've all sort of felt at one time as being hot or cold, and this is your body's response to it. But again, it lets us sort of get those three parts of these mechanisms, and it lets us know sort of what each one of those are doing to sort of maintain, again, our homeostasis. Okay, positive feedback mechanisms are a little bit different. So in this example, they're going to do the opposite to the negative feedback. So this results in the response is going to be enhanced. Okay, so response enhances original stimulus, and the response is also going to be accelerated. Okay, it's termed positive because the change proceeds in the same direction as the initial change. Okay, and this is going to be known as the waterfall effect. So again, anytime you get a special term, that's also a great thing to remember for your multiple choice questions. And a good example of positive feedback is going to be blood clotting. Okay, so let's take a quick look at that. So blood clotting is the response to a break in a blood vessel wall. You have platelets in the blood that begin to cling to the injured site. Okay, platelets release chemicals at the site. They're going to attract more platelets. We get this pileup of platelets, and then they're going to plug that tear. They're going to kind of stop the bleeding. Okay, but the output causes a change that proceeds in the same direction as the initial change. So I had this, these platelets that begin to cling to the injured site, and then I just get more and more and more platelets until I have fixed the problem and I've brought things back to homeostasis. Okay, so you're deviating further from the original value, so we get this more and more platelets are going to bleed up or build up until the bleeding has stopped. So it's moving in the same direction. If this was negative, it would be the opposite. I would get less and less sort of platelets. Okay, so two good examples. Another good example of positive feedback would be childbirth, and we'll sort of come back to that a little bit too. Okay, so here's your example of my clotting. So it gives you the 4 kind of steps. And again, you just want to analyze it and say, is it moving in the same direction or is it moving in the opposite direction? And again, most are negative. So if you get to the point where you're like, man, I'm really not sure which one it is, most of them in the body are going to be negative. So you can kind of use that one to help you a little bit. Okay, so now we get to the terminology part of the chapter. We want to start off with this anatomical position, and we want to look at our directional terms. And again, these are going to be really, really important when we get to the bones and when we get to the muscles. Okay, so anatomical position is basically just a starting point or a reference point. It's the point from which we describe anatomical locations of one structure in reference to another. And these are, again, for me, my main job is as a chiropractor. So you get MRIs and you get reports from different doctors and things like that. And this terminology sort of allows us to just make sure we're all kind of on the same page. Okay, so this is a picture of anatomical position. And the thing you want to sort of realize is that her palms are facing forward. Okay, so I can spin my hands in a bunch of different directions, but what happens if I spin my forearm one way or the other way is that I can change what's in the front or what's in the back of my body. So we want to just remember that anatomical position, the palms are facing forward, okay, and that makes that palm side the anterior part of my body. Okay, everything else is pretty easy to remember. So just remember, palms are forward. But from this point, I can sort of tell you, where are different parts of my body and sort of where is one in relation to the other. So directional terms are needed to explain the location of one body structure in relation to another, just like we said. It's going to allow us to communicate with others. It's going to help us to avoid any confusion, any sort of misunderstandings, especially if you're not in the same vicinity and you're sending emails or you're doing telephone conversations or you're reading reports. Very, very, very important. And again, this will come up a lot when we start looking at the bones, and because what happens is, if I break my forearm, okay, if I break the proximal part of my forearm, I'm looking at an elbow injury. If I break the distal part, I'm looking at a wrist injury. So if you break your radius or your ulna or different things like that, you want to really, really make sure that we're all on the same page and we're treating things properly. So now we get to the most important terms, okay? So, and some of them, again, are pretty simple. So superior, if something is superior to something else, it's going to be above. If it's inferior, it's going to be below. If it's anterior, it's going to be towards the front part, okay? If it's posterior, it's going to be towards the back. So we start off with some easy ones. Medial is going to be towards the midline. So if you come back to this picture and you draw a line right down the middle of her body, midline is going to be, it's closer to the middle, or lateral would mean it's further away from the middle. Okay, so towards midline or away from midline. Proximal, these ones are going to come up a lot in the bone chapter again, okay? So even with the bones and the muscles, you're going to hear proximal and distal. Proximal is going to mean closer to the origin of the body. Distal is going to mean farther away from the origin, and again, that's going to be towards that midline again, or that middle part of the body, okay? So this one's going to come up a lot, and again, this one comes up a lot in X-rays and MRIs and things like that. Superficial means it's towards the surface. Deep is going to be that it's away from the surface or more internal. And then these ones come up all the time too, and this is dorsal and ventral. Dorsal is going to mean towards the back, and ventral is going to be towards the front. Okay, so dorsal, the way most people remember that is the dorsal fin on a dolphin or something like that, but you want to remember that it's going to be on their backside. Okay, but dorsal, ventral, proximal, distal, those are the two that come up all the time, but the ones that can be a little bit confusing at first. Okay, so if you come back to this picture again, this would be ventral part of her body, right? And this is the backside, so that's going to be dorsal. And this would be the ventral or the anterior side. And the other tricky part with terminology is a lot of these are kind of interchangeable, and people will kind of choose which ones they like the most. But as you get more familiar with them, it gets a little bit easier, okay? And by the time we're done the bone and the muscle chapter, we'll be really, really good at all these things. Okay, so this is more part of our lab stuff, but we have these body regions. So again, you can look at this picture here and you can see this is the front part of the body. But again, I have terms for every different little region of my body. And this is one of those things that you just have to kind of go over and kind of memorize and practice. And again, these are things that are going to end up on that lab practical. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're really, really familiar with this picture and really, really good at sort of labeling it. And again, there's a practice sort of image in your lab images where you can just kind of go over it and just make sure you know it really, really well. Okay, so you have a front side, back side, and again, I get a lot of different terms that are going to pertain to certain regions of the body. So now we get to body planes and sections. You have three primary body planes, okay? They're going to lie at right angles to each other. And again, a lot of people don't really like it when you start talking about planes. A lot of people have, if you work out at the gym or you do a little bit of weightlifting or anything like that, you'll hear people describe exercises where they're working in specific planes. But we're going to divide the body into halves. Okay, so we have these three primary body planes, and again, all I really want you to know is that what do they divide the body into? Okay, so we're going to have a sagittal plane, we're going to have a frontal plane, we're going to have a transverse plane, and again, they're going to divide my body into halves. For multiple choice purposes, you just want to make sure, for labeling, you want to know, okay, what do they exactly divide my body into? Okay, so here are all my planes. So they talk about this plane of glass going from anterior to posterior, or left to right, or the transverse one is going to kind of go right through that middle part of my body and divide me into a top and bottom. But when I look at this picture, I can see that this one is dividing me into a left side and a right side. This one is dividing me into a front and a back, and this one is dividing me into a top and a bottom. Okay, so sagittal plane, Vertical plane divides my body into a right and left half. Okay, so very important to remember that. Frontal coronal plane, vertical plane, it's going to divide my body into an anterior and a posterior half. And then I have this transverse or my horizontal plane. And this is going to be the one that's going to run from right to left, but it's running horizontally, and it's going to divide my body into the superior and inferior halves. So if we come back to this one, we can see this one here divides me into a left and a right, sagittal plane. Frontal plane, this one here divides me into a front and a back, and then my transverse plane is going to divide me into a top and a bottom. Okay, so just keep it really simple, and again, just remember, what do these planes divide my body into? So now we get to the last part of our chapter, okay, and these are going to be our body cavities. So we have two sets of internal body cavities. The cavities are going to separate our different systems, and again, this is so that one system, if we're having a problem, doesn't destroy or affect the way another system is kind of functioning. So this is a very important way that our body kind of keeps us safe and keeps us as healthy as possible. But we have a dorsal body cavity, so dorsal's already kind of come up, so it's going to be towards the back, and we're also going to have our ventral body cavities. Okay, so if you look at this picture, and this is a good one for labeling on your practicals, this is going to be my dorsal body cavity. Okay. And then this part up in the front here is going to be my ventral body cavity. Okay, and I can see that my brain, my spine is in one spot, and then my area for my lungs and my stomach and my abdomen are going to be in another spot. Okay, so a good one to sort of just make sure that you can kind of label. So dorsal body cavity, again, is towards the back. You get two subdivisions. You get a cranial and a ventral part. Okay, they're going to protect our fragile nervous system. Your cranial cavity is going to encase your brain. It's going to be your skull. Vertebral or spinal cavity. My vertebrae are going to create my vertebral column. We'll come back to that when we get to the bone chapter 2. But these are going to protect or enclose my delicate spinal cord. Okay, so we want to go back to the picture, and we want to remember this part here in yellow is all dorsal, but I get part of that. And again, you always want to know like the sections of each or sort of what makes up each one. But here's my cranial cavity to protect my brain. Here is my spinal cavity here, okay, or my vertebral cavity, and it's going to protect my spinal cord. Okay, so now we get to the ventral body cavity, and again, this one's going to be towards the front. We get two more subdivisions. We get a thoracic cavity, and then we get an abdominal pelvic cavity. They're going to be located anteriorly, and their job is to house my internal organs. So here is a picture, and I get my thoracic cavity, okay, and then I get my abdominal pelvic cavity, but these two together are going to make my ventral body cavity. And I can even go back to this picture, and I can sort of see them kind of from that lateral view. Okay, so thoracic cavity, abdominal pelvic cavity, and I can see how they're even broken up a little more into different parts. And I can kind of think about, okay, what would fit in here, what would fit in here, what's going to be down in my abdomen, what's going to be down in that pelvic region. Okay, so my thoracic cavity is superior. It's surrounded by my ribs and chest muscles, contains our heart and lungs. So I get a pleural cavity, as we saw in the picture. It's going to protect my lungs. I get a pericardial cavity. So cardio is always going to mean heart. Pleural is always going to pertain to the lungs. But the pericardial cavity is going to protect that heart for me. Okay. Abdominal pelvic cavity, it's going to be more inferior. It's separated from the thoracic cavity by the diaphragm. It's going to contain our abdominal cavity, which is going to be a little more superior. So my stomach, my intestines, my spleen, my liver. My pelvic cavity is going to be a little more inferior, and it's going to contain my kidney, my bladder, my reproductive, and my rectum. Okay, and we had for one of the last exams that you take when you're in chiropractic school, you have to go into all these rooms and you have to sort of do exams on people. And one of the people that they had in one of the rooms, they had just a defect in their diaphragm. And so what happened was when you were listening to their chest, you could actually hear a lot of abdominal sounds, and which is something that you're not supposed to kind of hear. Okay, so they were just kind of doing this thing to kind of see if you would pick up and be like, oh man, I'm trying to listen to her heart, or I'm trying to listen to her breathing, and I'm picking up all these abdominal sounds. So it just is one of those things that you can sort of pick up, and you can sort of say, hey, I'm not supposed to be hearing abdominal sounds when I'm listening to someone's heart or listening to their lungs. So a tricky one. Okay, so here is our picture again, and I get my pleural cavity, I get my pericardial cavity, I get my abdominal cavity, and then I get that pelvic cavity. But again, all of these are going to make up that ventral body cavity for me. Okay, so abdominal, pelvic regions, and quadrants. This is another good labeling question for your practical. So I can divide this abdominal pelvic area into these different little regions or quadrants. I can divide it into 4 to get my quadrants, or I can divide it into 9 regions. It's going to assist us in locating organs and structures, and it's also going to be one of the ways where if someone says, hey, I have pain in this specific area, if you know what organs or what things are behind or in that area, you can sort of guess at what might be one of their kind of issues. Okay, so here's where I divide it into quadrants. So I just make this little cross here, and I get a right upper quadrant. I get a right lower quadrant. I get a left upper quadrant. And again, it's if I'm facing forward, this is my left arm, right? So this is left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant. And again, I can kind of see, okay, if I have pain in this right upper quadrant, my gallbladder is in here. The one that's probably the most common, or the one that everybody kind of knows about, is this right lower quadrant, and this is going to be my appendix pain. Okay, so again, good multiple choice questions of, what are the quadrants, and what might be causing pain in all those different little areas. If I want to be more specific, and again, for labeling purposes, I can divide it into 9, okay? So again, I get all these different little areas, and I can just be a little more specific, and I can have things that are in the middle, things that are over to one side, things that are over on the other side. But again, we just want to be familiar with the terms so that we can label them on our practical, okay? And again, we don't do a lot of organ stuff in this part of the course, but this will help you sort of when you move on to part 2. Okay, and then here's just a picture of what might be kind of in all of these different little regions. So now we get to the last thing, and it's the serous membranes. So these are going to be membranes that line ventral body cavities and the outer surfaces of organs. Okay, so you get 2 types. You get these parietal serosa. Okay, so if they're parietal, it means that they're going to line the cavity walls. Okay, very, very important for multiple choice questions. The visceral ones, or visceral serosa, are actually going to line the organs. So when I break this down a little bit, for each of these different little cavities, I'm going to get a parietal and a visceral part. Okay, so in the top one here, you have a parietal and a visceral pericardium. So a parietal one is going to line the pericardial cavity, okay, and then the visceral pericardium is going to cover my heart for me, and then I do the same thing for all the other kind of cavities. So if I have a parietal and a visceral pleura, we said pleura refers to the lungs, the parietal one is going to be the thoracic cavity, so it's going to line the cavity, and then the visceral pleura is going to cover my lungs, and then when I move down into my abdominal pelvic cavity, I get a parietal and a visceral peritoneum. So pericardium is heart, pleural is lungs, and peritoneum is going to be more my abdominal organs. So my parietal one is going to line my abdominal pelvic cavity, and then my visceral peritoneum is going to line the organs that are in that cavity. Okay, so again, just good terms, but good things that can pop up on all your multiple choice tests. Okay, and here is our last slide here, and it just gives you a little picture of where I can see the cavities, and I can kind of see where they're going to have these little linings, and I'm going to have these little membranes that kind of line the organs that are in there too. Okay, so you are done your first chapter, and again, this class kind of starts off where we got to do a bunch of just kind of little intricate terminology kind of things, but again, it kind of gets better as we sort of move along. But again, this chapter will help you when we move on to the other chapters, where we'll just be way, way more familiar with how the body is organized and just what some of the terminology is.